Chapter 14 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 14, Civil War. The administration was not slow to learn the lesson of the hour. Only half of the 20 days' notice to disperse, given the rebels by Lincoln's first proclamation, had elapsed. The troops under the first call had not been mustered in, and Washington could not be considered permanently safe when the formation of a new army for more thorough and prolonged work was announced. Not publicly as yet, but to the governors of the states who would be required to furnish the new levy. The several events detailed in the last few chapters dictated this step as one of such unmistakable necessity that it can hardly be said to have been discussed. It needed no demonstration to show that the South was in revolt and that the North was determined to suppress it. The actual boundaries, the time and course, and the probable phases of the conflict could not be mapped out, but the substantial fact of a serious military struggle of considerable proportions was self-evident. Preparations for it were therefore at once begun with cautious deliberation. 10 days after the first proclamation, the Secretary of War wrote in response to the overwhelming tenders of 3 months' volunteers from several governors, "No further troops beyond the quota of your state can be received at present, unless they will agree to volunteer for the period of 3 years, if not sooner discharged. In that event, and upon such terms, 1 or 2 regiments more would be accepted from your state and mustered into service." This was written to the governor of New Jersey April 26, and similar replies went to Connecticut, Indiana, and Michigan. From day to day, the same general answer and notification were sent out to other states, and a week later, May 3, appeared the President's proclamation calling into service 42,034 3-years volunteers, 22,714 enlisted men to add 10 regiments to the regular army, and 18,000 seamen for blockade service, a total immediate increase of 82,748, swelling the entire military establishment of the nation, including the regular army and navy and the troops under the first call, to an army of 156,861 and a navy of 25,600. It was easy enough for the President to insert numbers in a proclamation, but there is not room here to describe the task of deciding constitutional powers and responsibilities, examining laws, devising organization, and arranging details, all of which had to be done in a single week and in the midst of dangers. President, cabinet, and military and naval officers were busy day and night. It is scarcely possible to enumerate the elements of perplexity and unavoidable confusion suddenly thrown together. The abrupt revolutionary uprising, the tumult of enthusiasm in the North, the interruption of mail and telegraph by the Baltimore riot, the succession of military resignations and changes, the orders of the government at Washington, the extraordinary powers given to the New York Committee and acts performed by it, military orders by General Scott at the Capitol, and independent distribution of arms and munitions directed in the emergency by General Wool at New York, conflicting questions and requisitions from 16 different state executives, 4 different grades of military service, regulars, 3 months volunteers, state militia, and 3 years volunteers, still further complicated by independent organizations in border states whose governors refused cooperation, and all amid a quasi-field campaign about Washington. It was a bedlam compared to the dignified and deliberate red tape and pigeonhole methods of quiet times. What with the added necessity for urgency and secrecy, the principal departments of the government, greatly disorganized by resignation, for a short time staggered under the sudden burdens of routine work which could not wait, and which there were neither sufficient chiefs of bureaus nor clerks to expedite. Confusion even grew out of good-natured willingness to cooperate and zeal to assist. Impatient governors and state agents and irrepressible colonels and captains went to whatever fountainhead of authority they could reach. To Seward for a battery of guns, or to Chase for a horse contract to mount a regiment, there is no counting the knotty tangles of red tape which as a last resort were brought for the President to cut by his superior authority. Had Lincoln been a careless or a reckless man, it is difficult to imagine the damage he might have done, or the risk and excess he might have suffered the government to run into under such conditions. The enthusiasm of the North was already changing to impatience. He was beset by appeals to show energy, by clamors to accept more troops. Suggestions of every shade and merit were pressed upon him to consider or embark in showy and startling projects. One would have him seize and hang traitors, another burn Baltimore, a third destroy Charleston, a fourth liberate and arm the slaves, a fifth raise an army of 300,000. Whatever might be other differences, everybody was for promptness, vigor, action, advance. Delay was denounced, muttered accusations of incompetency were heard, and the New York Times, echoed by journals of less importance, boldly advised the immediate resignation of the cabinet, and, as already mentioned, warned the President that he might be superseded. In such a whirl, Lincoln's steady common sense and caution were a rock of safety to the nation. Whatever was essential, involving no matter how much responsibility, he did as soon as the necessity became apparent. But with equal purpose, he refrained from doing what was not essential, and often, generally indeed, refrained even from explaining or defending his non-action, or if he did explain, it was only by a casual and general allusion. Thus, on the 1st of May, during an interview with half a dozen members of the 7th New York, the President, in the course of friendly conversation, spoke in a tone of amusement rather than harshness of the Times's proposition to depose him, and said that just now the government had three things to do: defend Washington, blockade the ports, and retake government property. All possible dispatch was to be used in these matters, and it would be well if the people would cordially assist in this work before clamoring for more. The proclamation for calling out the troops, he said, was only 2 weeks old. No other people on earth could have surpassed what we had done in that time. But while he was thus patient and hopeful about the proximate form and issue of the contest, his discernment of its ultimate and underlying principle was clearer and deeper than that of any of his critics. For my own part, I consider the first necessity that is upon us is of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break it up whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves. There may be one consideration used in stay of such final judgment, but that is not for us to use in advance. That is, that there exists in our case an instance of a vast and far-reaching disturbing element which the history of no other free nation will probably ever present. That, however, is not for us to say at present. Taking the government as we found it, we will see if the majority can preserve it. The increase of the army once determined upon and the proclamation issued, the chief care of the administration was bestowed upon the organization of the new force. The best officers were promoted out of the old into the new regular regiments. The best arms were reserved for them and the 3 years' volunteers. No little complaint grew out of this discrimination. Every regiment, no matter of what service or term of enlistment, protested it would receive only arms of the latest invention and most perfect pattern. The northern arsenals were very scantily supplied, except with indifferent arms of antiquated manufacture. Commanders gave notice of danger that the term of service of some of the regiments would expire before they could be equipped. The national armories were driven to their utmost capacity. The President authorized the erection of a new and extensive establishment at Rock Island, Illinois, to supply the West. All available private factories and workshops were brought into service. Purchases in Europe were authorized. But military supplies cannot be extemporized, and the nation had no adequate preparation for such a vast army, so soon to be further augmented to colossal proportions. From all quarters came requisitions and demands for rifles, for cannon, for ammunition, for equipments, for tents, for transportation, for subsistence. Many places in the country, hitherto unconscious of danger, suddenly felt alarm at the possibility of exposure. The New England seaboard wanted garrisons in the government forts, and heavy guns to guard against possible privateers. A feeling of insecurity spread along the river towns of the Ohio. The western frontier asked for arms to prepare in time for the Indian outbreaks likely to follow hostile conflict. And to provide these resources, the administration had a nearly extinguished revenue and a paltry $10 million loan. Fortunately, at this point, the enthusiastic patriotism of the hour touched everything with its miraculous wand. In the fervor of these early weeks, considerations of money faded from the popular thought. The men who were willing to die for the Union tendered it their wealth with unstinted liberality. For the 3 weeks ending May 8, the indirect donations for war purposes were estimated at 23 millions. Government credit was unbounded, and a man might as well have insulted the national flag as to have questioned the national solvency or honesty. There was no more talk of compromise and conciliation, of conventions and constitutional amendments. The universal determination of the North was well summarized by Mr. Seward in a diplomatic dispatch under date of May 4. The United States waited patiently while their authority was defied in turbulent assemblies and in seditious preparations, willing to hope that mediation offered on all sides would conciliate and induce the disaffected parties to return to a better mind. But the case is now altogether changed. The insurgents have instituted revolution with open, flagrant, deadly war to compel the United States to acquiesce in the dismemberment of the Union. The United States have accepted this civil war as an inevitable necessity. The constitutional remedies for all the complaints of the insurgents are still open to them and will remain so. But on the other hand, the land and naval forces of the Union have been put into activity to restore the federal authority and to save the Union from danger. Meanwhile, the rebellion was not idle. The hot spurs of the South were eager for a sufficient blood sprinkling to arouse a crusade against the Yankees and to cover the false pretense under which they had lured the states into secession. But the leader dreaded the test of prolonged war and clung to the hope that the North would not fight. On March 4, the rebel War Department submitted estimates for a modest peace establishment, and on the 14th an additional army of 5,000 men to reduce Fort Pickens was the only project for an active campaign. Even after Sumter, Howell Cobb declared there would be no war and advised the people that they could go on cultivating their crops. Letcher, as late as April 24, by proclamation, counseled his gathering Virginians, not in the military service of the state, to return to their usual avocations in connection with the trade and commerce of the country. Out of this long-cherished dream of peaceable secession, the South was for the first time fully awakened when regiment after regiment came pouring into Washington, when treason was choked in Maryland, when the Western capitals became great camps, when the blockade began to close the seaports of the South. More alarming was that increasing activity of the Northern uprising, the earnestness of which could no longer be denied nor mistaken. Justice John A. Campbell, who had by this time resigned his seat on the Supreme Bench, sent Jefferson Davis an impressive warning on this point under date of April 28 from Washington. The Northern States are in the wildest condition of excitement. Some of the truest friends of the South have given in their adhesion to the policy of defending the capital. General Pierce, General Cushing, and Mr. Dickinson will occur to you at once as men not likely to yield to a slight storm. It seems to me that the importance of peace was never greater than for the next 60 days. We cannot get along at all by looking only at our own side of the question, or to the emanations of our own people. The 7 Confederate States have not more than double the number of male population capable of bearing arms, which has been offered to this government as volunteers since the 15th of this month. New York, Boston, and Philadelphia will pour out its capital even for subjugation. The impression that we had firm, stanch friends North who would fight for us was a delusion. Oh, I pray you do not rest upon it. Though not anticipating this result, Davis had probably long since counted it among the chances of the rebellion in which he was embarked. Always possessed of great self-confidence, he made a show of composure at the unwelcome prospect. For him the crisis had its encouragements as well as dangers. Half of Virginia had joined him. He yet had hopes of Maryland, and 2,000 extra muskets were at Harper's Ferry to strengthen the next émeute. The last vestige of Union defense was gone from Texas, where Van Dorn had just compelled the surrender of the remnants of the United States forces, and also captured the famous steamship Star of the West. North Carolina, though she did not formally secede till May 20, was already to all intents and purposes a member of the rebel Confederacy, and at that moment sending Jefferson Davis captured arms from the Fayetteville arsenal, and marching regiments organized under state authority. In the other 4 border slave states, the conspiracy was so active and strong, and so thoroughly assured was he of their adhesion, that he had made formal requisitions on them, April 22 and 26, for regiments which should rendezvous at Lynchburg and Harper's Ferry to help sustain Baltimore and make sure of Maryland. His faith was not entirely misplaced. Directly and indirectly, Tennessee sent 3 regiments, Kentucky 1 and Arkansas 1, in response to his summons. Missouri replied with promises of future help. In spite of the conspiracy of their governors and other state officers, both Kentucky and Missouri were saved to the Union. But for the moment, Jefferson Davis was perhaps justified in believing that the whole South would soon be solid for the rebellion. Under his call, the rebel Congress met at Montgomery in special session April 29 and deliberated till May 21, enacting by the advice of himself and his cabinet such laws as the crisis seemed to demand. An act recognizing war, regulating privateering, acts admitting Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas to the Confederate States, an act authorizing a $50 million loan for 20 years at 8%, and an act regulating the export of cotton, require no special comment. More noteworthy was the act practically confiscating for the use of the rebellion all debts due from Southern to Northern citizens. Warily also they laid the foundation for that unsparing military despotism which their desperate enterprise demanded. In mockery of their states' rights theory, the central principle and very pivot of secession, they authorized Davis to accept and organize companies into regiments, regardless of any call on the states, to accept outside regiments, and to assign Confederate officers to command state troops without displacement or loss of rank. Perhaps their most important action was a joint resolution removing the seat of government to Richmond, where on the 1st of June the rebel capital was duly established. Davis had been warned that a Union reaction was at work in Virginia, and it was doubtless intended that both the sentiment of pride and the rigor of his personal discipline should hold her steadily to the fortunes of the rebellion. Since the organization of the Montgomery government in February, some 4 different calls for Southern volunteers had been made, which would yield in the aggregate 82,000 men. In his message of April 29 to the rebel Congress, Jefferson Davis proposed to organize and hold in readiness for instant action an army of 100,000, making the total equal to the total of both Army and Navy summoned by Lincoln. The work of fortification was going on in all directions, on the sea coast, on the Potomac, on the Mississippi. The captured forts and the Norfolk and Pensacola navy yards had furnished them an abundance of heavy guns. The 6 or 8 captured arsenals supplied them with 18,650 rifles and 145,154 muskets. The latter inferior arms, it is true, but yet effective if well used. In addition, several states had made separate purchases. The martial spirit was up, and paper regiments were becoming real ones. There was an occasional ebullition of impatience and insubordination from Southern governors, but the farcical republics of South Carolina and other cotton commonwealths were things of the past, and the Confederate States of America pretended to an empire of territory and no mean nation of inhabitants. Jefferson Davis had been orator, statesman, soldier, and Secretary of War, had practiced the art of government, and seen something of the operation of armies. He was cold, cynical, ambitious, but had talent, experience, energy, and an indomitable will. He was now virtual dictator of the South and understood the crushing, fusing, welding power of military rule. We must assume that under these favoring conditions he believed in the success he predicted, that since he had matured his conspiracy, he would establish his government. End of chapter 14.